here to listen to the deep expertise and inspiring knowledge share from Karen Washington, who is a long time leader in so many different fields, in the food justice movement, in the urban gardening movement, and in the regenerative agriculture movement. I have been very fortunate to have met Karen before on another panel for another organization, and came away just feeling deeply inspired and hopeful, and also fired up about challenging the narrative around farming and food systems. And so, yeah, over to you, Karen. I'm really looking forward to this class.
Thank you, Slow Factory nerds and people, for joining me for the second half. And I was invited to talk about the work that I have been doing. My name is Karen Washington. I tell people I grow food, I feed people, body and mind. I've been growing food for over 37 years. And as an activist and advocate for food, social and economic and environmental justice, I want to again bring into question the agricultural system that for so long has been extractive and exploitative, realizing that this planet can no longer sustain itself if we continue to go that route. As a result, people are lifting up the principles of indigenous practices of stewardship, healing, restoration, which is now being called regenerative agriculture. I want to bring my ancestors into the room. I'm in the Bronx on Lenape land, and I want to make sure that we understand that. Can I have the next slide, please? And so in part one, we explored agricultural history in the United States while changing towards regenerative or indigenous agriculture and the impact it would have on fashion and city planning. In part two, which I was asked to talk about, we'll examine the impact industrial agriculture has for the future and how you can advocate for change. And for me, it's going to start with seeds. Many people are now rediscovering their history through seeds, even here in America and throughout the world. People are claiming it. In this discovery, we will follow the trail laid down by our ancestors as sovereign keepers. It's time for us to come out of the shadows, y'all, and into the light as we try and understand the true meaning of seeds, because it's seeds that hold the key to unlocking the history and secrets of time forgotten in our stories. From Europeans to Africans, seeds not only store vital energy for survival, but store the history of people. As an African American, I grew up not knowing the knowledge or history of my people, intentionally erased were the intellectual wisdom and knowledge of my ancestors as they fought to survive in an unfamiliar land and unfamiliar territory. I can only imagine what they were thinking about as they were trying to board a ship to an unknown place. What could they take that could not be discovered? What could they take that could be hidden or could not be confiscated? It was seeds. Seeds that would give new life as they travel afar, a long journey from a home unfamiliar to them. But as seeds do, always find a place to survive, to live again. Histories from our ancestors, grandma, grandpa, abuelo, will tell you that seeds were placed in areas hidden from the sun, in orifice of darkness. They were meticulously braided into our hair, a hair that was coarse and thick, a good hiding place. Hair that would protect one from the elements of heat, rain, and eventually snow. Yet it will be these seeds sown on this unfamiliar land that will grow food as sustenance and eventually feed a nation. But that road was hard and arduous. You see, seeds are the foundation of life. Our ancestors planted seeds not only to eat, but to celebrate life. There was drumming and singing and dancing. They were used for currency to display wealth, as well as adornments to accentuate beauty. to grow plants that would eventually be used for clothing. During the colonial era, the process of discarding indigenous crops gained further momentum as the emphasis was on cash-growing crops, such as sugarcane and chocolate. In this slide, during the Columbia Exchange, transportation of goods and plants and animals happened between the Old World, which was known as Europe and Asia, and the Americans and West Africa. Since they didn't have ships big enough to cross the Atlantic Ocean, trade only occurred between these two continents. However, once the big ships were introduced and they could cross the Atlantic Ocean, hence was the beginning of the transatlantic trade, which include not only the New World, but its new cargo, people. Throughout that time period, little or no mention is made of the vast ecosystem that was happening and the impact it had on the biological and cultural landscape of this new world. Still, when it came to the history of African botany, scientific nomenclature, genius of plant species, and the knowledge that was there, it was either ignored or pretended to be discovered by Europeans. Even prior to Columbus' explorations, Africa, because of its tropical climate, was the main source of the world's food supply. Yet history has always portrayed Africa as a continent of scarcity, needing help from European intervention. Next slide. Once upon the arrival to the New World, seeds became a mixture of Afro, Euro, indigenous cornucopia of different food ways of culture. Food made its way from the Old World to the New World. And to think that African culture is a monolithic is to say that all Africans are alike, when in fact, slaves came from all parts of Africa, from different regions, tribes. Their languages were different. Their methods of growing and cooking food were different. Plants from seeds sowed with different ethnicities had messages hidden inside on what they would become on non-native land. Next slide. In this slide, you would see the contribution of African to the global food supply. And this can be seen in some of the staples and crops that we normally see, such as sorghum, black-eyed peas, watermelon, corn, rice. Many Africans were healers and brought that knowledge to the New World. Medicinal herbs such as tamarind, bitter melon, pepper. Because Europeans didn't know the name of African seeds, they would often use the word Guinea as a reference to the origin of African experience. Once in the New World, slave owners would always keep their stuff different and put aside from the slave experience. Housing was separate along with food. And when they didn't understand the origins of plants, they discarded them and called them weeds. Next slide. And here you have the reference when I talk about how they would call our plants using the word Guinea. Next slide. However, as plantation owners watched our work, they saw our methods. They saw our knowledge, our use of tools, our culinary skills, and they took that knowledge and made it their own. Because ownership of a slave was property. They had no rights, claims, or ownership. European demands for the New World resulted in an increase in labor. Yet, next slide, the one pivotal seed that the enslaved Africans brought with them that would change a nation and bring wealth to it was rice. Back in Africa, women were the farmers of rice. But in this new world, it would be both men and women. The colonial South was looking for a new commodity that they could export to bring wealth to the plantation owners. These owners, however, were unaware of how rice was grown, but enslaved Africans did, because the climate of the lower South of Georgia, South Carolina, was similar to the climate back home. The swampy terrain was perfect for growing rice. Next slide. Seeing how Africans were able to use the swampy climate of the low country was a novelty to many plantation owners. They saw how they could harvest the plant, use a pestle and mortar to move the hard outer husk and bring it to a grain. Once the plantation's owners saw this, they knew right away that this was a cash crop. And as a result, hence, can you go back? Go back. Go back, back. You're going forward. It's okay. You're going back. Okay, just try to go back. Take your time. This happens. This is why you're doing this slides and not me. Okay, right there. Go back. Go forward now. Go forward. Stop. Once the plantation owners saw that the rice was now edible, hence started the transatlantic slave trade of millions of Africans entering the border of the lower South. Next slide. Another cash crop was indigo, a non-edible plant that was grown beside rice. And again, the plantation owners did not know how to grow it or use it. But again, enslaved Africans knew, and as a result became a cash crop. And it was used, the dye was used to promote wealth and status. Next slide. However, when that crop died down, the next slide, please. The next seed that would change a nation would be cotton. Cotton was given the name king because of the fact that it was bringing so much money and as a result, so much in the slave trade. Believe it or not, when we talk about the slave trade and what was happening when it came to cotton, people really think that cotton was a staple in the South. But the more profitable mention of cotton is in the North, because the North had the businesses, they had the capital, they had the money. And so when we talk about the slave trade, we shouldn't talk about it in terms of it always originating in the South. The North had its hand in the slave trade as well. So in the beginning, when you think about cotton, the industry was slow. The industry was slow because of the fact that, the next slide, in order for cotton to be produced, it took 10 hours for one person to clean 1 pound of cotton. After the invention of the cotton gin, it took 100 pounds of cotton to be cleaned in 1 day, which meant more pounds, more money, and more people. Next slide. Just think about cotton in terms of the economy. In the early 1800s, the mass production of cotton was around 150,000 bales. By 1860, that number increased to 4 million bales. Just think about it. 1860, nearly 40% of that cotton was being exported to Britain and Europe. 75% of that cotton came from the American South. produced by American slave, receiving zero American wealth. Next slide. The ultimate downfall of cotton came because of Reconstruction. The new gem was the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution, where agriculture and the textile industry started to burst open. It came about because it was more mechanized and more efficient. Chores that were normally done by hand were now done by machine. And as a result, the effect of labor was dominant. People all of a sudden left the lands in the South and moved to the North. Men left their families, and eventually children and women entered the playing field. I want to stop here to sort of take in the contribution of enslaved people and indigenous people, because this is not talked about in the building the economy and wealth of this country. We don't talk about how within agriculture, this country was built on the backs of enslaved and indigenous people. And I want to take the time to understand that and give it homage, and to make sure that when we talk about regenerative agriculture, when we talk about how we're going to move towards mitigating climate change, the people who will be affected the most are poor people and people of color that live in urban areas today. And unless we understand our place in history on how we built this country, the knowledge that has been erased, then we don't fit into the American experience. So for me, it was important to really go in and review our place in this history. So once you understand your place in the American experience and American history, then you can be asked to have a seat at the table when it comes to talking about climate change and regenerative agriculture. So I just wanted to make sure that I give people that power of ownership of their place in the American history and American agriculture. So today, both textile and agriculture continues to grow as demand for cheap clothes and cheap food increases. Both have greater demands on land, fuel, labor, natural resources, water, questioning the sustainability of our planet. So as we look forward to the future, in the midst of climate change, the industrialization of an agricultural system has played a major role in disrupting a food system that is not protecting seeds. Rather, it has offered the opportunity for companies to patent them. And this is the heart of this lecture when we talk about seeds. Next slide. Why are seeds important? They're important because they tell a story. They tell a story of people, our history, our culture. Seeds are fundamental to life, yet they're being threatened. It is estimated that between 90 and 95% of seed diversity has been lost forever. I'm talking about extinct, never to come back. That means that the genetic code imprinted to survive and diversify is now lost. We have these big companies like Dow, DuPont, Bayer, Monsanto, turning a seed industry into a business, accumulating a multi-billion-dollar industry. Yet it behooves me to think that there are 7.8 billion people on this planet, yet we allow a handful of companies to control our agricultural system. No longer is the farmer, making decision on plant breeding and seed saving, though it's the farmer that's putting that seed in the ground, that's nurturing that crop, that's harvesting that crop. Many times the farmer has to ask permission from the seed company that they purchase if they can even harvest that crop. Many years ago, there was a huge headline of a farmer who took Monsanto to court because of the fact that Monsanto claimed that the wind blew the seed over on his property, and that, in fact, he had no ownership of that crop. There was Monsanto that now owned that crop. But folks, how do we get here? How do we get to the point that we have allowed seed company to patent seeds? Because if you think about it, who are we? Aren't we seeds? Isn't DNA part of who we are? Next slide. How we got this way is all because of people with power and privilege and money. So they started patenting back in 1930. And so the patent protection was only for asexual plants and seeds. That means seeds that really couldn't replicate, and they left food seeds alone. However, as everyone knows, power and privilege comes into the picture. And in 1970, they made an adjustment. This time it could be all seeds, however, with a 25-year moratorium. Power and privilege comes again. And in 1980, the Supreme Court ruled that it was a legal right to patent an organism. And I say that because before the decision, it was believed that all living organisms belong to nature, not to a human being. So now we have a handful of companies, y'all, supplying seeds, not for culture, not for diversity, but for higher yields, flooding the market with hybrid seeds. And with hybrid seeds, they don't reproduce and you can't save them. Even convincing farmers that it's best to buy from them because it will offer less burden. However, we have a food system that now is offering seeds that are static, giving no biodiversity or cultural lineage. The impact that this has happened can be seen a couple of years ago when Haiti had undergone the major earthquake, and so many seeds company came to their rescue. And the seed company came to dump hybrid seeds into Haiti. But the Haitian farmers were smart enough to realize that those seeds were not native to their land, that those seeds were hybrid seeds. And as a result, they will be beholden to big seed companies for fertilization and chemical use. And so what those Haitian farmers did is take those seeds and burn them. So now you have big companies trying to do the same thing now, but they're not relying on creativity or diversity. They're relying on uniformity. It's not just the seed that's being impacted as we think about climate change and we think about regenerative agriculture, but it's the decrease in biodiversity, which is having a huge impact on the whole ecosystem. Right now, when it comes to food security, out of some 12,000 seeds, only 150 are cultivated for food consumption. Just think about that. We just went through a virus. And can you imagine if one of the seeds got infected, or if one of the seeds had a major problem, the impact that would have on our food supply? The impact of plant genetic diversity has been lost and compromised due to monocropping, based on yield production, the use of chemicals, which are impacting our environment, water supply, and bee population, as well as climate change and genetic modification. Like I said before, seeds are fundamental to life, and they're being threatened, never to come back again. Around 75% of the global food supply relies on intervention from animals and insects to pollinate them. But the one insect that's being compromised is the bee, and bees are in danger. Such a catastrophe would jeopardize our food supply. We must look at how seeds, plants, animals, water, soil, all play a part in the health and well-being of this planet. So now for some encouraging news. Folks, we got gardeners, we got farmers, we got seed libraries, we got activists coming together to give seeds a new life. They're encouraging people to grow heirloom seeds. They're saving seeds on their own, but they're not saving seeds to own seeds. They're saving seeds to share, bringing back the knowledge of seed saving to a whole new generation of growers to celebrate life, culture, and knowledge. Next slide. Saving seeds now has become a grassroots movement, along with access to land. People are starting to reconnect to the earth. Regenerative agriculture, realizing how one can preserve the best traits of a particular plant without diminishing its value. They're talking about preservation, protecting the life cycle of a plant, performance, creating traits that are strong and viable. And this is when we talk about mitigating climate change, understanding that the seeds have imprinted genetic code that can work with the soil to help it against climate change, to fight against climate change. Seeds, again, vital to life because they talk about the history and legacy and tradition of a people. They're not dependent on big ag because big ag doesn't control it. Reducing costs because we're not paying for these seeds, we're sharing these seeds. Helping the pollinators because without pollinators, we don't have food. Adaptability and education. Next slide. And I say that's important because here's a slide of me on my phone with my family, getting them to understand the importance of growing food, the importance of saving seeds, but also bringing my family back into the conversation on why it's important to grow on land, to have land, and to grow food. Because for so many of us, we've gone away from the land. And as a result, we've lost our power in our connection to agriculture. Next slide. This is farm school, y'all. So on our farm, we ask students to come on our farm. Look at this slide here because at Rise and Root Farm, we're up in Chester, New York. We have 3 acres. We're in the black dirt region of the county, and look at it, it is black dirt, 40% organic matter. But again, getting students to understand their relationship to land, their land place, their relationship to growing food, and getting their hands in the soil to touch the soil, to feel the soil, to smell the soil, to have that connection so that these will be the next entrepreneurs and players when it comes to talking about climate change. Next slide. And then you have people who are saving seeds to talk about their cultural lineage, their cultural experience. Next slide. And you have companies that are saving seeds. Many of you may know Ken Green. He does the Hudson Valley Seed Company, or Owen Taylor, who does True Love Seeds. Again, these are companies that are now taking back ownership of saving seeds because it's so, so important. Earlier in the conversation, I talked about, in part one, talked about soil health and how indigenous practices with nature is working with nature, how good soil fertility depends on water and nutrients and crop rotation and minimal tillage and cover cropping. Farmers are now learning and using indigenous principles of agroforestry, biodiversity, crop rotation, intercropping. People are using technology not to grow more, but how do we grow more efficiently? When we think about regenerative agriculture, it's not about systems, y'all. It's about technique. It's about using practices that have a positive effect on the environment and people. Regenerative agriculture is more than working on mitigating carbon and soil fertility. It's about maintaining and supporting ecosystems, communities, and people's health. Next slide. In the textile industry, change also has to happen when it comes to our clothing industry. And people are thinking about recycling their clothes, using fabric that have been protected and have been really encouraged with regards to biodiversity, using non-toxic material, and making sure that the waste of dyes are not going back into our waterways. Being an advocate for change. What makes regenerative agriculture more pressing these days is the effect that it has on climate change, and how, again, that messaging is now filtering down to the people that are being impacted the most. And hopefully we can start having these hard conversations so that the impacted people do have a seat at the table. Next slide. We are at a critical time in our life because of COVID. People are looking at socially responsible businesses, businesses that treat their workers as well as the planet humanely. This is a time to rethink how we spend our dollars on the food that we eat and the clothes that we wear. COVID has already made us sick. We don't need our food or our clothing to make us sicker. In the future, it's going to be the consumers who will be looking for value, quality, and sustainability. As farmers, for some of us, it's not about growing food and feeding people. It's about food justice and food sovereignty. Many of us are growing ways that are honoring the land, honoring the people that came before us, whose practices that are not extractive. They're listening to nature, planting seeds according to the season, conserving water, never leaving land barren, instead using compost, planting legumes, cover crop to add nutrients, less tilling of soil so as not to disturb the microorganisms. Next slide. So what does the future look like? And what does the future look like in cities? It is estimated by 2050, there'll be an additional 2 billion more people on this planet. That means from 7.8 billion to now 9 billion people on this planet. And most of the people will be in urban areas. There was a case study by Gunnar Hauser-Hand, Robert Weber, and Nathan Bloomstone that looked at LA and the importance that community had in describing a 10-season design. They came up with these principles: livability, using infrastructure such as streets as commercial corridors to create development; equity, optimizing capital that will support living wages; and empowering a workforce that will provide stability and that will prevent that G word, gentrification; ecology, learning to live with nature instead of nature learning to live with us; nutrition, preserving farmland and thinking about using city structures like rooftops and walls, forming local food co-ops and hubs, community gardens and urban farms; thinking about access, less on cars and more on public transportation; thinking about waste, composting, and turning waste into energy; water, thinking about stormwater catchment, planting more trees and bioswales; resiliency, addressing natural hazard conditions and being prepared; energy, thinking about clean, renewable energy, such as solar and wind; and the most important is heritage, preserving history and culture. We cannot talk about regenerative agriculture if we don't preserve and talk about history and culture. So in conclusion, y'all, we're asking not only the farmers, not only businesses, but consumers to take some responsibility when we talk about regenerative agriculture and sustainability and climate change. Are we looking for a utopia? Will we get to the promised land? Both agriculture and the textile industry are multi-billion-dollar businesses that are invested in change. They must be involved. Next slide. Action steps. How do you be involved? How do you be proactive instead of reactive? Use your dollars wisely. The power of that mighty dollar to make change. Ask questions. Hold your elected officials accountable. Call out businesses that are destructive, extractive, exploitative. Read labels. If there's words you cannot pronounce, you cannot be putting them on your body or putting them in your body. Use clothes, donate, refurbish, reuse. The last is be involved. Folks, it's going to take all of us coming together and brainstorming what this new planet is going to be. We have only one planet, and that planet is Earth. Even though we got people trying to get on these rocket ships and trying to get into atmosphere, don't believe that hype. We have one planet Earth. So how do we make sure that it's habitable for the next generation? Only time will tell. And I just hope that we are all around to see it. Next slide. I leave you with this, a quote from Maya Angelou. We cannot change the past, but we can change our attitude towards it. Uproot guilt and plant forgiveness. Tear out arrogance and seed humility. Exchange love for hate, thereby making the present comfortable and the future promising. My name is Karen Washington. I tell people I grow food, I feed people, body, mind, and spirit. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Karen. I think that judging from the chat, quite a few students in our class today might feel the same way as I do after going through all of the emotions during your class. Thank you for, skillfully guiding us through historical suffering and rage. Really eloquent calls for accountability and seeding hope, concluding with the planting of seeds of hope. That was just phenomenal. I see quite a few questions in the Q&A and want to remind people, and people are blowing up the chat right now as well, saying what an incredible, moving class, and that you're a born educator, and lots of clapping and gratitude. I want to get to the questions in the Q&A box, but actually before we get to that, I do have two pressing questions I wanted to ask you about. You brought up the topic of holding the government accountable. And over the past few years, I think we've seen a reinvigorated conversation around around reparations for the historical and ongoing violence of racism in this country. And as you mentioned and touched on in your class, that occurred across all sectors of society, especially within agriculture. And so what I wanted to ask you about is why on earth I can't remember the exact name of it, but it started as a sort of Black farmers reparations bill to remedy some of the terrible discrimination in USDA financial support for American farmers. Of course, Black farmers were left out of that because racism. And there's been several iterations of this bill. And then recently, there was a sort of emergency relief for farmers of color that was passed, I think, earlier this year or maybe last year. And I have read that it's basically money is not being dispersed to Black farmers. Can you talk about what some of those obstacles are? The white farmers who are clogging up the works with the lawsuits, and really kind of how can we mobilize to support Black farmers and remove some of these obstacles to this long overdue financial reparations work?
Okay, first of all, thanks for giving me that question. And it's not only about Black farmers, but it's also indigenous farmers as well. So let me make that clear. That have had land stolen. And so it's a conversation that white folks are fearful of. I mean, and they're using their power and their privilege to go to courts and to prevent money being placed into the hands of indigenous and Black folks. And this is why it's important to make your local legislators accountable and to ask questions and to ask why. And to act locally. For example, we've had this problem here in New York State. I live in New York State. Out of 57,000 farmers, only 139 are Black. The wealth disparity is enormous. 11 times more wealth for white families than for Black families. As many people know, the amount of land that people of color have is less than 1%. And so, again, going to the powers that quote control the economic system and also legislation system and not being heard, we decided that, you know what, we're going to form our own farm fund. And we started the Black Pharma Fund. You can look it up, Black Pharma Fund. And the reason why we did that, because how long, Black folks and brown folks, we get tired of waiting for the government to have that savior mentality. And so a lot of us have taken upon ourselves to talk about accountability. And because of the racist things that have happened to Black people regarding George Floyd and others, all of a sudden, there's like white guilt that's out there. But the thing of the matter is that it's time for us to have those hard conversations around race and how this country was built. And this is why when I talk, I want people to understand, when right now, people are so upset about critical racial theory. They're upset about that because they don't want to know the true meaning of how this, or the true knowledge how this country was built. And so you have people shunning away from the truth and putting in, well, you can't give all to Black farmers because now you're discriminating against white farmers by having this Black Farmer Act. When in fact, it's not about discriminating against white farmers, it's talking about inequity when it comes to land access and wealth. And that's where we need to talk about. Don't talk about, when you try to make it a racial issue, whites pounce on that and talk about reverse discrimination. Talk about the inequities, that the wealth inequities, the land inequities that we have, to bring that to the surface so that people can no longer use that in terms of throwing it back in our lap. And so, again, having these hard conversations around land reparations is very, very hard because land gives you power. Majority of white people have power, they have land, and they don't want to give it up. But let me tell you, folks, I tell people there's three things that people with power have to do. Either they have to give it up, they have to share it, or it's going to be taken away, and welcome to the next revolution.
That is very, very real. Thank you for that, Karen. I also have a follow-up question, which is, what is the role of the community land trust? And is that a tool that we can look to for future regenerative models, maybe outside of this waiting for the government to finally honor its obligations?
Definitely, because with community land trust, again, the power, I'm talking right now about power shift. And so people want to know, like, what can you do beyond COVID? What is happening beyond COVID? And for me, the emphasis has to be on community power. And what community land trust does, it puts the power back in the community to make changes. The community now has access to make decisions on housing, about affordable housing, or how land is used, or how businesses are established. Yes, it's the beginning of taking back power, but in areas that we don't have community land trust, I'm talking about communities coming together to share their communal wealth and social capital. What does that mean? Words that people don't understand. Because, back in the day, folks, I'm 67 years old. Back in the day, how people used to get ahead, because believe it or not, the banks, and they still don't want to loan us money, give us credit. So people would come together and form what we call susus, put their money together so that they could purchase a house, send their kids to school, start a business. And so we're starting to have those conversations within our communities and getting beyond the outsiders' terms of communities of color or urban communities of being deficits and problems, and looking at our community as being resilient and strong, and coming together to think about how do we turn the exploitative, extractive system that has played us, used us, turn it around and start thinking about what can we do within our communities locally? How can we bring local commitments of putting money together to build and own businesses, putting money together to build and own affordable housing, putting money together to build schools that provide an education that's culturally based. And so we're starting to have those hard conversations. We're starting to have those conversations about taking back the food system. During COVID, I remember when the city told the community gardens to shut down. We said, hell no, because COVID was affecting our communities. And what did we do? We got together, knocked those locks down, went into our gardens and started growing food. But not individually, we started to form collaborations with other community gardens. Okay, what are you growing? What do you need to grow? How do we come together? How do we grow food? How do we make sure that the food is given to our communities? How do we outsource? How do we do distribution? All of these things that COVID has taught us that we need to continue to do. And I just want to say one thing to my fellow workers that are in the food system. I love y'all. I'm saying that because for so long, we know who the essential workers, the farm workers, the small farmers, the restaurant workers, in hospitality at one time were getting nothing. Now it's flipped. Now they understand their power, and now they are demanding and asking not only equal pay, but more pay. And so now you have all these companies and businesses that are short staffed. You know what? Because you are paying a restaurant worker maybe $7 an hour, an undocumented worker 50 cents an hour. That's changed now, because now you know who the essential workers. So if you want us, you got to pay us. You have to pay us what we deserve. And I'm so glad that a lot of people now are holding back and showing their strength and their power, that if you want my services that are in demand, you must pay me what I am worth. And that's what is happening. So that's why the shortage is happening, because people now understand the power they have within the working environment. My hats go off to them. You got me going.
Yes, I hear it, and that's great. I mean, I got chills listening to you respond to that. I'm really like letting what you said sink in, and what's kind of arising for me is this interpretation, and please tell me if I'm misinterpreting.
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing you say is we really cannot expect the dominant system to change in a way that honors people and justice. And so it's really incumbent on us to build new systems outside of the mainframe. That doesn't mean we give up on, putting our legislators and government officials' feet to the fire. However, we can't only do that. We have to build new systems outside of the mainframe. Is that a correct representation of what you're saying?
The new system is community. That's a new system. For so long, people ask me the question, no, the food system is broken and needs to be fixed. The food system is broken and needs to be fixed. And, I always tell people, I was drinking the Kool-Aid, leave to be fixed. And I'm saying, wait a second, why in a country where we have so many resources, we still have hunger, poverty, and homelessness? Why is it that in poor people neighborhood, our food is crappy, and rich white affluent neighborhood, their food looks really good and healthy? Why is it people tell us to eat healthy food, but healthy food is more expensive? And so for me, it's not that the food system is broken and needs to be fixed. The food system needs to change. And that change comes with shifting of power, putting power back into the hands of the community. And it's like a wake-up call. So wait a second, because for so long we've given up our power. People in brown, Black communities, we've given up power. We've laid back, and we've elected officials tell us what to do. Lobbyists tell us what to do. Big Ag tell us what to eat. Sitting back and figure, you know what? No. Now is the time for us to regain our power, and again, making people more accountable. So, perfect example. Okay, I'm going to say this. All right. Like during the holiday, I always think about Martin Luther King's birthday, right? First of all, if I ever see it being monopolized and played like a holiday for shopping, you're just going to be something. And I said, that's a time where Black and brown people don't shop. Don't shop. You know what I'm saying? Hold back your money. We have to start thinking about how, because collectively, people think that we're poor and we don't have, but collectively, we put our money together, we can stop this country like that. We don't shop, keep our money, hold our money together. We have a company that's not doing us right. We don't shop and we don't pay our money to that company. There's a store that's not going to help feed our neighborhood. We don't shop at that store. And we need to understand that the power collectively that we have. And I want to see one day when we have companies that don't fit our needs in our community, we don't patronize them. We hold our dollars back. And if we do this on a national level, when we take one day and we show this nation the power of Black and brown people when it comes to the economy, and we don't shop, what do you think is going to happen? I'm going to be leading that charge.
You are leading that charge. You are leading that charge. I want to just note a really great local example of that in my own neighborhood. You probably know Brooklyn Packers, Brooklyn Supported Agriculture. They mobilized in a big way during COVID. They did a lot of food security and food justice work to people who are really food insecure during the pandemic. And they grew their community supported agriculture program in a really smart way, and recently purchased land upstate. And they're starting a farm. So, it's a great kind of example of the trajectory. And it doesn't have to take a decade. They actually were able to do that in a relatively short span of time. Okay, so I've been monopolizing the Q&A a bit, but those were burning questions, and I just was, dying to ask you. In our Q&A, we have a question from Mariana, and they're saying it's so important to learn to cook. Cooking, I guess, cooking intentionally has the potential to protect seeds by the act of choice, supporting food diversity, eating nutritiously, cooking with less waste. And would love to hear your thoughts about the connection between cooking and food justice.
Yes, oh my goodness. Let me tell you, see, this is why I wanted to talk about the history. This is how this country was built. And a part that I left out was the cuisine. Indigenous and Black folks have been, first of all, I look at these shows, these barbecue shows, I look at all these shows, and I'm saying, well, wait a second. Where are our faces on this culinary experience? Because back in the day, you were not in the kitchen cooking, making all these dishes, doing the barbecues, making all these different types of dishes. And yet, when you see today's cuisine, it doesn't even talk about the African American indigenous experience when it comes to food. We out of the picture, but yet, wait a second. But we was in the kitchen cooking. We was in the kitchen making the barbecues. We was in the kitchen making, the gumbos and jambalayas and all. We was in the kitchen doing that. And yet our stories are not told. And because our stories are not told, people have no reference of their power in the American experience. And their reference then comes from fast food, because McDonald's and the fast food companies have co-opted and taken that meal, that important substance of being in the kitchen with your mom and your pa and your grandparents, and learning how to cook and taking the culture of your experience into that meal and taking that away from us because we have no knowledge of us participating in cooking food, and having us using us as victims to purchase junk food. Your question is so important for us to get back into the kitchen and to learn from the elders. And I say that because when I give a talk, I always talk to young kids. Take out those Samsung Galaxies and iPhones and speak to grandma, grandpa, abuela, all the ancestors, all the people, all the elders in your family, and talk about how it was on a farm. Most came from a farm or grew a garden. They never went to a grocery store. They didn't go to no restaurant. They got their meals from the land. They came and brought that land and brought that food to the home, and they cooked together and they sat down together. We're missing that element of agriculture, which is culture based, to sit down and share a meal and have a conversation. And then when people don't have a meal, you shared it. We've gone away from that. We've been so brainwashed, whitewashed, and losing our power. But one thing I would say that's promising, you have so many young people that now understand their history and their relationship to land and culture and food, and it's no longer a localized entity. Because of social media, they are having these conversations globally. And as a result, starting to take back the system, wanting to grow food, wanting to understand about medicinal and culinary herbs, wanting to go back into the kitchen to reframe the narrative that has the essence of their culture in the food that they're eating. This is why, folks, I'm telling you why community is so important. We for so long have looked outside our community for answers, where the intergenerational elder youth experience is right there for the taking.
I could not agree more. I love what you said about community is the new system. You know, community is the old system and community is the new system, right? It's what we need to take us into a more hopeful future. And I also love that you mentioned Susu. You know, there are a lot of active Susu groups popping up all around New York City and all over
Around the world.
Around the world, but kind of popping up as like a new way of reconnecting to old systems that work really well. And also, just to mention, Susu is a practice that also is used across Asia. You know, in my own culture, it's called get, monthly get, right? It's basically a Susu is a revolving credit union. You put in a certain amount of money every month, and each month the pot goes to someone new. So it's a kind of savings program, and people use it for down payments on a house, for opening a business, for purchasing land, and whatnot. So I really love, you know, that you're touching on so many kind of collective systems like Susu, community land trusts, and communal farming and urban farming. Those are all kind of communal systems where everybody gets together to co-create abundance. So, you know, we know from your talk and from the answers to some of these questions, the importance of really re-engaging with traditional collectivist systems, and maybe, you know, innovating them even more to take us into the future. At the same time, there are some very real threats that we also have to fight within like the mainframe. For example, the stuff that you brought up about seeds, about Syngenta, Monsanto, you know, the sort of creation and almost coerced distribution of seeds that don't even reproduce, you know, leading to just horrible things like massive farmer suicides across South Asia, for example, or other geographies. So, you know, this is also from the Q&A. How can we really mount an effective resistance to this kind of biotech violence that seems really sinister and hard to understand? And, you know, for someone who lives in an urban environment and they're going to the store, okay, let me not buy GMO, fine. But are there other ways that we can really support the fight against those seed violence?
Believe it or not, if you're in the food movement, there are seed saving groups that are happening. And you need to get involved into seed saving groups. I was a couple of years ago, I'm not going to say the location, I'll just say the Southwest. And I happened to go into one of my friends' house, and in their basement, they had a cellar of all different types of seeds. And the reason why they did, and it was hidden, and to be honest with you, we don't advertise. You know what I'm saying? So it's almost like I just shouldn't be really saying this, but I'm just saying it's almost like a sort of secret sort of entity that people are doing because they know how, first of all, how important it is, but then also it raises alarm for it's a threat to big companies. It's a threat to big companies. And so I would suggest follow the chain of people growing food in urban areas like community gardens, and start having that conversation within your local community. And you will find groups that are saving seeds and are training and teaching people how to do it. That's all I can say. I said a lot, and I'm just going to just end it like
Yeah.
that, but just, yeah.
I just put in the chat also a recommendation for the film Seed, the Untold Story. And I feel really emotional just hearing from you the kind of insinuation that saving seeds is now like a risky activity where, in some countries you could be really targeted for creating a seed bank. And I just,
Yep.
it's really hard to comprehend how far we have come from, ways of living that are connected to the earth and that value the right things. So, saving seeds is a revolutionary thing that we can all do together. So yes, let's all get involved in our local seed saving groups. I think given the new national, and something just came out today, it's like the National Intelligence Estimate Report. It's basically this report by intelligence people in the United States. And they are talking about, the sort of potential of facing global famine as early as 2030. And so saving seeds and learning how to grow is actually a very, very urgent imperative. We all need to learn how to do this. We all need to plug in to the, farm and food and seed justice movements. We can't wait any longer. Karen?
I just want to say, don't fall into the trap of these big companies now saying that they can save the world by having seeds and genetically modifying these seeds so that they can grow more with less dependence on water or so. No, because you get these seeds from these seeds company and you're beholden to them. And whatever sort of seed that they genetically modify, they have control of it. They control everything. And so that's why, this is why I said it's so important. This is a conversation we need to have offline, folks, and not, because I don't know who's on here listening. So let's sort of not continue, but you know what I'm saying, you know how I'm feeling. And we just need to take back our power collectively as community.
One thing we can do that is, a very low risk activity is if you have access to land, whether in your own yard or in your community garden. Sorry, I have to let the dog out real quick. But please look for heirloom seeds. There are lots of companies out there like Ted's Heirloom Seeds or Baker's Heirloom Seeds or one of those places that we get our seeds from. Anyway, you can search and look for heirloom seeds and support those companies. Again, you know, where you put your dollars really matters. Karen, do you have anything more to say about, you know,
No.
seed recommendations for home gardeners?
Yeah, like I gave you, I got True Love Seeds, I gave you Southern Exposure, I gave you Hudson Valley Seeds. Let me tell you something. It's just how we've been sort of brainwashed. So you bring to the market heirloom tomatoes, and heirloom tomatoes look crazy funky, all shapes, and then people, they're not used to seeing heirloom tomatoes, so they rather get the big beefsteak red tomatoes. Until I tell people, take this home and come back and see me next week. Because they've never been exposed to it. They've never been exposed. Again, the propaganda, the marketing that infiltrates our communities of heirloom tomatoes are so delicious. They're so flavorful. And the more uglier they look, the more incredible tasty they are. But yet we have been, again, don't do that. Just use the hybrid ones. They have no taste. They have no taste whatsoever, no flavor whatsoever. So again, heirloom seeds, variety, they don't sometimes look like your traditional stuff that you see in the store, but remember, they contain the DNA and trace of history, of culture, of lineage, and many times they taste fantastic. So yeah, see?
Yes, yes, yes. Yes, to ugly vegetables.
My favorite is striped German. Just want to put that out.
Okay, that's something for me to look out for. Karen, we've kept you a little bit over time. I'm sorry, we got so caught up in the conversation that I just realized it's 1:17.
Oh, yeah.
I know you got to go. We still have a lot of people on the line, so they stayed with us because I think the conversation was so enlightening. Thank you, Karen. Please follow Karen's work on Instagram. It's Rise and Root Farm. And your personal, is it okay if I share?
Yeah.
It's car washer, like
Yeah.
KRWASHER. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing seeds of revolution and hope. This is a reminder to all of our students who are still with us that Open EDU is part of the open knowledge and open education movement. We are deeply committed to making these classes free for everyone, but obviously it takes a lot to compensate our incredible instructors fairly, to have teams of ASL interpreters, to make these classes accessible, to provide the recap and the downloads after the classes, to edit the videos and put them online. So if you are able, I'm really asking on behalf of the Slow Factory team to become a monthly donor. Even just 10 or 20 bucks a month is really, really meaningful and helps us keep this entire program free for people who cannot afford traditional higher education, and also for people who are looking for a different paradigm outside of traditional education. So if these classes are meaningful to you, and if you are in a position to do so, please consider making becoming a monthly donor and sustainer of this program. It's, $20 a month. Think of, like, I don't know, 3 overpriced cappuccinos if you live in New York or LA or London or something like that. It's really a matter of collective economics, as we talked about in this class. And this is another way to kind of support a collective endeavor that is really important for changing our future and planting seeds of hope. So thank you so much, Karen. Always a pleasure. Always a pleasure.
Bye, everybody.
Yeah.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. And please look for our recording online in about a week or so, maybe 2. Bye.